So welcome to Persecutory Cultures. And I have to salute anybody who wants to look at this show. I feel like it's a very hard show, very painful subject, and also a very important one. And I'm going to be covering a lot of ground here. This could go off in a lot of different directions. There could be entire presentations on patriarchal enforcements, conquest, settler colonialism, slavery, witch hunts, torture, religious persecution, punishments of homosexuality or gender nonconformity, holy wars, silencing of women, racialized caste systems, ethnic conflict. You get the idea. There's just all these bases that human beings have done terrible things to each other. But what I'm looking at here is systems of oppression and the ideologies and methods of persecution, how those resemble each other, in some cases how they differ. But I'm going to be ranging over a wide area of topics. And I'm really trying to spare you the worst. I could have a lot of, there's some very heavy slides in here, but I'm leaving out the very worst of the worst because they're so bad. But I want to begin by looking at stoning. Let me get over here to, let's look at this full screen so you get the full view. Yeah, so this is Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Bible, and one of several, quite a few actually, enforcements of male supremacy, but using violence, using persecutory punishments in order to enforce male domination. And so a very asymmetrical punishment of women for not being virgins on marriage in this case. And there are other examples where a priest's daughter is to be burned to death for the same thing. And so you have the very strong enforcement of the sexual double standard, which goes on across much of history, not just in the Hebrew tradition, but also in the Muslim world. The stoning was not written into the Quran, but it does appear in most of the schools of Sharia law in Asia and Africa. And this is from Iran in the Qajar period, so this would have been several hundred years ago. We often see a very differential punishment of women, though you will see men being stoned sometimes too, especially as a punishment for intruding on other men's chattel, men's female relatives. That, as in the Bible, an enforcement of the sexual double standard and of women and children as property. And so, but I want to shift over a little bit here because some of the early examples of religious persecution that we can see is part of the domination by the Assyrian Empire. And so you see them carrying off the sacred statues of divinities from the conquered Arabs or the Canaanites or whoever it is that they're going after in this picture. You know, this was a big empire in southwestern Asia. And another of those was the Roman Empire. And so we know crucifixion primarily from, everybody knows about it, from the Christian story, the crucifixion of Yeshua of Nazareth. But in fact, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people were forced to undergo this torture execution as a standard mode of punishment under the Roman Empire. Just in Palestine alone, there were tens of thousands of Jews that were executed in this way. Also rebellious people who rebelled against slavery. So you see those kinds of punishments used in a persecutory way. And heresy is a base for this that we see a lot in the ancient Mediterranean world. Here we have a heretic shown here in the lower panel amongst all the authorities, the bishops and rulers, being denounced. And so believing differently becomes a basis for persecution. So there's the claim of absolute monopoly on truth by, in this case, the Byzantine Orthodox bishops, but also the Roman Catholic ones. And this is something that we see used also against heretics in the Muslim world. For example, in the 800s and 900s in Baghdad. And there are many other examples of religious persecution like that. But if we look in the Roman and Byzantine Empire, we see this casting out, the anathematizing of heretics. And the word heresy means, and this actually says eretiki down here, heretic means one who chooses. It is a difference of belief, but we see here, burn him alive, let him be cut to pieces. So there's this very hateful attitude in the name of spirituality, ironically enough. And Rome enacted this very early on, as you see from the dates there, against Algerian Christians who had their own ethnic form of Christianity. And there was this enforcement by the empire. You have to do it our way. It's a top-down, hierarchical, authoritarian religion, and it follows patterns set from Rome. And so here, burning of heretics, which is something we see turning up in the 300s and from then on. And so here's the word eresis in heresy in Greek. And it came very quickly to mean a prohibited sect. And so here again, eretiki. And so they're the damned Arian heretics. The books are being burned. And this is kind of this is a later picture showing something that went on in the 300s in a Frankish manuscript. And so the Byzantine emperors were really going after a large group of people in various persecutory ways. Pagans, Jews, the so-called heretics, gays, and of course very patriarchal laws as well in the codes of Justinian and the other emperors. But I want to shift over here and look at a pattern that we see in medieval Europe. And these are various kinds of ordeals which were sex-specific, to a large degree at least. And so the ordeal of red hot iron was one of these. And we see, for example, a very elite woman, the wife of the German emperor, and her name was Kunigonde, being forced to walk over red hot plowshares. And she's not allowed to scamper across them at her own speed. She's being held by the bishops, and they are pacing her as she walks barefoot over this hot iron. And this was a very common ordeal over much of Europe, Western Europe at least, parts of Eastern Europe as well, as a female ordeal. And so adultery, sorcery, there's one other category I'm forgetting about, but basically female inchastity is one of the ways that this ordeal was used to keep women in line. And so another method was not walking on the red hot iron, but holding it, being forced to pick up a bar of incandescent metal and carry it 9 paces or 12 paces, whatever the protocol was. And then if she was burned, it meant she was guilty. Pretty bad setup there. So a number of Spanish law codes, and this is not a very well-known area of the witch persecutions, what happened in Spain. But a woman who is a witch or sorceress shall either be burned or saved by iron. And saved by iron means that she will be cleared if she, after 3 days after being forced to hold this hot iron, if she doesn't show any sign of burns. And otherwise, she could be executed, which would be the bulk of them, I would imagine. The fire ordeal of chastity or female sexual purity is also known in India. And there may be a very, very old Indo-European connection here. These are distant linguistic relatives, at least. But in the Ramayana, Sita, the wife of Rama, is forced by him to undergo the Agni Pariksha in order to prove her chastity, that she was abducted by the king of the demons, but nevertheless, she succeeded in remaining pure. Somehow she managed not to be raped. And you can see here in this picture that Rama himself is actually throwing her into the fire, forcing her to do this, and, is really concerned about his male honor, that, he could not be perceived to have a wife who might have been, quote unquote, unfaithful, meaning raped. That would be dishonoring to him. And so you've got this use of fire in that way. But so is water. And so in Germany, this was called the Hexenbad, or the witches' baths. This is a Swiss manuscript from the 1400s or so. and showing them pushing her underwater. She's bound. This was a catch-22 ordeal. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent, but if she floated, she must be a witch and was guilty. And so this was in use for a long time. We have examples shown here from a German law code of the 1200s, and over here, still going on in Germany in the 1600s. It was also used in France, in England, and other places as a test for guilt in witchcraft. And you can see in this image to the sexualization, the way that she's bound, exposing her genitals. This is part of what we're going to look at in a little while, the pornographic element in witch persecutions. But in any case, here we've got, again, probably the iron bar that they're examining. She's failed the ordeal and she's being led not to the stake, but to a pyre. And there aren't a lot of representations of witch burnings from early medieval Europe. But we know from written records that they were going on. Not that there was any exhaustive record keeping happening, but we do have references from chronicles and law codes and other sources that women predominantly were being burned alive, either at the stake or here again on a pyre. This is also from the Sachsenspiegel, which was a German law code. And so there is a period over 1,000 years long in Europe where you have witch burnings going on. And so the stereotype of this is that it was all carried out by the church, by the Inquisition. As we can see here, this is the 9th century Charles the Bald, who did call for the counts of the realm to extirpate witches by burning at the stake wherever they found them. So this is way before the Inquisition was founded. And it continues after it's founded. So in the 1300s, this is a lord sending out men with mastiffs to hunt after witches. And on the opposite panel is a witch riding on the back of an animal. So this is one mechanism of scapegoating. We're going to see several examples of this within just medieval Europe. But one of the ways this worked was to target certain groups, women, Jews, heretics, gays in some cases. Here you've got the women resisting the sermon of the holy friar and devils floating above their heads. And so this is this obstinacy of people who refuse to be ruled over by the clergy. And one of the big groups that happened to were the Jews in Europe. Not only in Europe, but the persecutions in Europe were by far the most severe. And so I want to turn to look at that, because we can see here several means that are used to mark out a population. Here they're being expelled, their expulsions. We're going to look at a map in a minute. But they're forced either to wear ridiculous hats, as you'll see in many medieval manuscripts, these pointed hats that the men were supposed to wear among the Jews. Here you've got men wearing the tablets of the law as badges. And so the Jewish badge that we know of from the Nazi Holocaust has much deeper roots, going back as much as 1,000 years before in Europe. And so here again, men physically assaulting these male Jews. And I want to just signal that also using dress as a way to set off a group of the population for persecution and oppression was also known in other places. Here's an example where the Dalit castes, the oppressed castes in South India, there was a law that the Dalit women could not cover their breasts. They had to be set apart visually and also sexualized by not covering their breasts. And there was actually a tax that was levied on them and a revolt that finally happened around this because it was so onerous to them. Another group that I haven't been able to get visuals for, but in Islam, the peoples of the book they had a certain status in Islam, not as high as Muslims, but they were signaled in some cases by wearing distinguishing dress to set them apart. But anyway, coming back to the Jews, you have a lot of legal distinctions. They're a separate class that have separate penalties, separate taxes, executed, and very often burned. So at the same time that we have witch burnings going on, in medieval Europe, you have also burnings of Jews and sometimes destructions of entire communities in massacres. This is Strasbourg in the period of the Black Death, the plague that was at that time spreading all over Europe. And so Jews are being blamed for that. So in these examples from Central Europe, you have them with the hats, and over here we see them with the badges. So this is marking them out. These are Jewish people that are being burned at the stake. I think this is either Germany or Switzerland. And so a lot of people don't know this, that burning before the crematoria in the Nazi era, there were men in Germany, and particularly in the 1300s, who went around attacking Jewish people who were known as Jew roasters. So there are precedents for all of this. And so over a period of many, many centuries in Europe, you have massacres, destructions. You see here the forcible baptism and sometimes seizure of children away from the Jewish community. And here you can see the expulsions. These are just the most important ones, and you can see that England kicks out the Jews, and then France follows. A lot of them flee to Spain. Spain expels them. They run all over the Mediterranean. They wind up in Bulgaria and Turkey and other places. But the main thrust of migration in the face of this persecution is eastward, and they head into Eastern Europe. Poland, at the time this began to happen, like for example this date, Poland was only a recent convert country to Christianity by means of the king. Saint Stephen converts the whole country by decree. And so the Pope is writing warnings to the clergy there to watch out, because Poland is just a new plantation of Christendom, and to be careful that the Jews do not have influence there. And so this goes on all the way up to the eve of the Holocaust. And we can just note in passing that, the man is shown here as bearing the entire burden, and the women and children are kind of an afterthought. But this is a very marked pattern historically. And if we go all the way back to the period of the late Roman Empire, we see both Jews and heretics being attacked with something that's known historically as the blood libel. This means the accusation that this group committed ritual murders as part of devilish ceremonies. And so they shed blood. And so that's why it's known as the blood libel. I've got this picture here, though, because this scholar, Norman Cohn, has done a lot of documentation of how a lot of the later witch hunt themes and Jewish persecutions in Europe had their roots in older themes from the late Roman Empire. And so even before, in this example, this is a Greek writer. This is the earliest example of the blood libel that is known, where they're claiming that Jews would take a Greek into the temple and sacrifice him. And this is still being passed on in the first century, this accusation of Jewish ritual sacrifice. It really goes up against a lot of the Jewish law, particularly around the shedding of human blood. But, that, of course, was not their concern. So this blood libel by various priestly figures such as Augustine of Hippo, he claimed that the Manichaeans, these are the ancestors of the Cathars, ate their babies. The Manichaeans believed that, the spirit was good and flesh was evil. And so they, reproductive sex was not a good thing, according to them. But you see also the use of accusations of orgies, of using sexual fluids, menstrual blood in some cases, in order to prepare sacrificial cakes, or boiling or roasting children. And these slurs were used as a way to make everybody hate the persecuted group by spreading lies about what their religious practice consisted of. And so this is what we see in medieval Europe. And this begins around the time of the Crusades. The idea that Jews took a Gentile boy, shown here as a saintly figure, being, executed, and sacrificed them, especially at Passover. And so these very distorted notions of what Jewish religion was about are passed on, and they're used to whip up outrage, attacking children, and especially boys, among the Gentile population, which then led to numerous pogroms. And you can see also the sexual organs being targeted here. So there's all kinds of themes and anxieties going on. And through the process of this anti-Semitic blood libel, you see Miriam of Nazareth, the mother of Yeshua, right, Jesus. She gets rewritten not just as the Virgin Mary, something she would not have recognized, but also as the one who reveals how the evil Jews killed Gentile boys in their ceremonies. And so there's a lot of the stories of the pogroms start with her revealing perhaps the body of a boy who drowned in the river and saying, well, the Jews did it. So very, very cognitively dissonant mixtures of a Jewish woman being used as an element in these persecutions. But the other element is that witches, like Jews, were accused of killing children for their ceremonies. And in this case, very often cooking them and eating them. There's some overlap here with the older slurs, both of witches, but also of heretics from the Roman Empire. So if you read the poet Horace, for example, Horace, he accuses witches of killing children, using their body parts in ceremonies. But there's another element to this also, and this is really where this arises in medieval Europe, is that you have, from the 5th century forward, priests declaring that women who give herbal contraception, emmenagogues, abortifacients, are guilty of murdering children. And so in southern France, Cesarius of Arles, so much contraception, so many murders. And this was the stance of the church over the next 500 or 600 years, the idea that this is infanticide. And so all of this gets wrapped up in the period of torture trials with the devil mythologies, diabolism, as we're going to look into it. And going back again to that old idea of heretical conventicles feasting on babies, and witches in the company of devils. And so you will see this in written form as well as in representations like the one we just saw. So here is Reginald Scott in the late 1500s saying that the witches will capture children from their mothers and use them, kill them for their ceremonies, and even sacrificing their own children. There was no lie that was too wild for them to make up. And so this theme continues in the art of Goya and other literary sources, as well as actual accusations used in various inquisitions and secular witch hunts. The idea of the witch as a baby killer. And this is a blood libel. But it has another effect, because the witch hunts in Europe were the ideology of this blood libel and of these persecutions was exported to the colonial world, Europe colonies in especially the Caribbean and South America. And so you have the same theme of boiling humans in cauldrons and then feasting on them. The word cannibal, according to linguists, is related to the word for Carib. And it may even be partly a writing thing, the N and the R looking a lot alike, but that's pretty well agreed. And so when you look at Amerigo Vespucci, after whom the Americas were named, some of the early reports of travelers have these accounts of consuming humans. This says here, New World, and you've got these stereotypes of Indian people, of Native people eating humans. The same kinds of cooking them in cauldrons over the fire, or some cases roasting them, as you will also see in European accounts. And so there is this transfer of these horrific stories, and they get really grisly here in the pictures, from European themes that existed long, long before these conquests took place. And really, we could track this all the way back to the Roman Empire. And so because the way that these ideologies function is to say to Europeans, these people are not human. They perform these devilish and horrific atrocities, and therefore anything we do to them is going to make things better. in that country. So we need to Christianize them. They're savage, they're barbaric. And it's okay for us to enslave them because they're such evil people. They really need to be controlled by the colonials. And so you have the enslavement of Native peoples who legally, according to church law, were not considered gente de razón, reasoning people. They were people without reason. And so, therefore, the same laws did not apply to them. They could be forced to labor, as we see here, in logging, various types of resource extraction, plantation, slavery, all through Central America, South America, and Caribbean, and also in North America. And this is something that's not as well known, but the slaving on Native people was also going on by the English, by the French. And so, you can see executions and all kinds of other atrocities because the conquest treated the Native people of the Americas as not human. And I want to back up again and look at the Crusades for some of the roots of how these attitudes came about. And both on the grounds of being religiously heretical or not adhering to the true faith, being infidels, but also, as we're going to see, there's going to be a racialized rationale that grows up very quickly in the context of these European holy wars. So the first crusade in the late 11th century is preached by men who were inciting violence against the Jews, the unbelievers amongst us, as they would, as Peter the Hermit calls them. And so as the Frankish crusaders set out from northern France and then march across Germany and across Europe, they targeted Jewish communities at Speyer, at Wiln, at Prague, many, many cities along the way, and committed pogroms. Here you can see again the hats. These are Jews being targeted here by the Crusaders. And so the first victims of these religious wars were the Jews. But then we also have the Muslims in Asia and Africa as legitimized targets. And this quote here is attributed to Pope Urban II in his call for the First Crusade. It dates about 100 years later, but this is the thinking, at least, of the Crusaders of that later period, where they talk about an accursed race, wholly alienated from God, and wrest that land from a wicked race and subject it to yourselves. Oh, what a disgrace if a race so despised, so entirely the slave of demons, should conquer God's elect people. So it's setting Christians above everyone else. It is racializing everyone in both, all of them, Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the quote-unquote Holy Land. And so when they arrive in Jerusalem and take the city, they slaughter everybody of all those religions. And there are descriptions talking about Crusaders hip deep in blood, splattered from the slaughter that it wreaked on the entire city without regard to really what the religious belief was. It really was a racialized persecution. Also, something that a lot of people don't know is that the Crusades that went on for centuries against West Asia and even into North Africa against the Muslim world were also turned by the 1200s against pagans in Europe. And so we've got a list, and this is kind of chronological. The Saxons in the 9th century, the Czechs and the Wends in the 10th century, 11th century, Eastern Europe going on through the 1200s, 1300s, and finally as late as the 1600s, the Sami people in the far north are targeted for being pagans or infidels. And so military monastic orders like the Teutonic Order, the Brotherhood of the Sword, and other groups committed invasions that were full of atrocities against the peoples of Eastern Europe, especially the Baltic countries, against Prussia, Lithuania, Latvia. And the descriptions of these in the chronicles, they even themselves say, we did this, we killed everybody, we destroyed everything, we burned them all, we captured the women and children and looted the place, and returned with great rejoicing and praised the Lord. And the pagans were perplexed and made great weeping and sorrowing on account of the multitude of the uncounted numbers of the slain. This account could easily describe what the Anglo and other European settlers were carrying out against Native people during the conquest, the invasion and conquest of North America. It also describes what was done to Africans during the course of the slave trade. But the rationale of this, according to the church in Latin, cuius baptizatio eius regio, to he who baptized, to him the rulership. And so this was a code that was evolved very early in the Christianization of Europe, that the church would side with whoever would forcibly conquer and Christianize all of these other countries. And so that's what was done. And there was this process of conquest that went on over 1,000 years. And when they were done in Europe, they turned around and did the same thing in the Americas. So here we have Peruvians being slaughtered by St. James, Santiago, who was first the patron saint of the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims, and then became the patron saint of the conquest of the Americas and also in Africa. And so you see an extension of these colonizations going forward in time. Now, while we're speaking of Africa, I want to talk also about the fact that the jihad as a holy war, jihad means struggle in Arabic, and it has other contexts in a religious sphere, but it is used, for example, the Sokoto jihad or the Fulani jihad in the early 1800s. It was used in Nubia and many other places to refer to holy wars specifically against pagans, against heathen, or as they're called in Arabic, kufr, the kafirs, the pagans. So in both of these systems, the Christian and also the Muslim, it was regarded as legitimate to make war on unbelievers. And the realm of Islam is called the House of Peace in Arabic, and everything else is called Dar al-Harb, the House of War, or sometimes Dar al-Kufr, the realm of the pagans. And so it was legitimate to invade, to kill, to steal the land, to steal the people, and to enslave them under both these systems. For all the differences that are claimed between these religions, they were practicing this same strategy of attacking people. And so, for example, when we see the Spanish colonizing Central America, they referred to these countries as the land of war, the exact equivalent of the Muslim form. And in the same way, it was legitimate to slaughter them and to enslave them. And so there was massive slave trade going on in Central America and the Caribbean of Native people. And this was happening also out of North America, out of the English colonies into the Caribbean. They sold off the Pequots, for example, after the massacres there in was it Massachusetts, I think, into Nicaragua. So this code was followed by both groups of these two competing religions. Here you've got captives being marched off into slavery in Paraguay. Here we've got the same thing happening in perhaps Niger or Chad or some other part of the Sahel region, south of the Sahara, perhaps by Hausa or the Homeyan slave traders. And this was going on out of West Africa into the Americas by European traders, and out of East Africa by Arabs and Swahili traders into West Asia, Sudan, into Egypt, all the way further out into Arabia itself, and even into Iran and Gujarat in South Asia. All because they're unbelievers. So the justification of these acts, this is what, I mean, we can talk about oppression in a much larger context, but I'm truly trying to show here are the patterns of ideology that justify acts of violence in the name of religion in this case. And so the same is true if we go back to Europe with the heretics. These would be Christian, heterodox Christians is how the academics would put this. They do not follow the Roman Catholic code. or the Greek Orthodox code in some cases, they believe otherwise. They're following just the Bible, and they're not going with all these overlays that were accumulated. So burning at the stake, imprisonment, torture, and confiscation of lands were all used, confiscation of property. This is showing the Albigensian Crusade, which was against the Cathars in southern France. And there was a notorious quote from one of the bishops who told the Crusaders, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Anyway, out of this conquest of southern France by the northern Catholic armies grows the Papal Inquisition, which was a process of enforcement to impose Catholicism on these conquered populations who were very resistant. And so the Inquisition is started in 1231 with a papal bull. Now here you've got a spiritual Franciscan. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But witches, Jewish converts who went back to their old religion, heretics, all being subjected to this persecution. And very quickly, within 30 years, we have another papal bull called ad extirpanda, which means stamping out, that authorized the judicial use of torture. And they were borrowing this from old Roman law. Both the Greeks and Romans had judicial torture. And it was revived as the jurists were reading back through all these Roman texts. And so this is something that had really dire effects. I mean, first of all, it's an atrocity to do this to any human being. And, it was very quickly extended beyond heretics to witches, which is what really pumped the witch trials into the massive craze that they became. But along with this, we have book burnings going on, all kinds of suppression. Religious wars are happening coevally with all of this. And you're seeing also heretics as well, Protestant heretics in later periods being persecuted. But what I want to really signal about the use of torture is that you can force people to say anything by using torture on them. And there was a very important part of the doctrinaire theology being enforced by the church at the end of the Middle Ages and going into the Renaissance that we can call diabolism, or devil worship, an ideology that claims that heretics worship the devil. Sometimes they call them Luciferans. Witches worship the devil. Native peoples worship the devil. And so there's a very strong cluster of symbols and ideologies of stories that are told about this. For example, here we have heretics who are shown worshiping the devil in the form of a black cat. This is already circulating in the early 1200s. This is from the 1400s, and it kind of shifts over. Usually the devil is portrayed as a billy goat, and they are forced to worship him by giving the shameful anal kiss. And this occurs over and over again in writings of persecutions against heretics. Now, one of the groups of heretics, the Cathars, get stamped out. And the Vaudois, as they were known in French, the followers of Peter Valdo, this form of Bible Christianity becomes known as Vauderie in the persecutions of the 1300s. There were actually inquisitorial crusades also against the Western Alps to stamp out these people who had taken refuge in the mountains. But the word Vauderie comes to mean witchcraft or sorcery. And it was a diabolist concept about, you can see the sexualization happening here of devils having sex with witches. And this became a favorite pornographic theme of the torture chamber. The demonologists fantasizing about all the sex that was going on, women having sex with the devil. That this is what witchcraft was. It was a sexual enslavement to the devil by women. And so you see these accusations making their way into the torture chamber. Another aspect of this sexualizing of demonology was that gay sexuality was also being targeted. And so, for example, you see devil having sex with a not very happy looking guy there. The spiritual Franciscans that I referred to earlier are also being accused of sodomy in the persecutions of that group of progressive, service-oriented, poverty-oriented Christians in the 1300s. And so you'll see that accusation of same-sex, men going with men and women going with women, orgies, both in the heresy trials and also in the witch trials. Now, these are the Almaricians, who were not only pantheists, but were also kind of a free love group in medieval times. And it wasn't always burning at the stake. You have really horrifying executions, impalement, and here a man being sawed in half for sodomy, for being a catamite, for being engaging in gay sex. And the word catamite is interesting because it means a man who lies underneath. So that makes him like a woman. And all of this kind of gay men, you could maybe have, trans women or any other group could be wrapped up into that persecution. But I want to talk just for a bit specifically about witches, because this is the bulk of those who were burned at the stake for sorcery over a period of long, long centuries. The worst of the craze really begins in the late 1500s, and you can see how bad it was from this Swiss painting, multiple burnings. The women's head shaved. I'm going to come back to this because shaving of the heads was considered to be an anti-magical power, to cut off the woman's hair, her glory, her power, but it was also a form of ritual humiliation that had been applied against women for centuries already in time. And so you see the use of torture, in this case, rubbing ropes against the throat of a woman. The devils are doing this in the picture, but in fact, this is done to actual women in the torture chambers, as we see, for example, from some Scottish accounts. And so the demonized woman below, and pointing to her tongue, which is significant, as we'll see, and then above, the all-male Trinity, God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So this polarity of demonic old woman and saintly male friar were part of the education of men who grew up to be dukes and other kinds of rulers, who became bishops or who became inquisitors. And this was a very strong ideological branding of European culture. When we look at the sexual politics of the witchcraft trials, it's very important to see how much has to do with men battering women or deserting their wives, women who use herbs for contraception and abortion, accusations that women are making men sexually impotent through the form of witchcraft, or injuring men, or forcing them to do things they don't want to do, or making them fall in love, or causing babies, animals, or others to die or become ill, blighting crops. And also we see sexual abuse being described in some of the trial transcripts, girls who are living in as servants saying how a man came to them at night and forced them to have sex with him. And so there's and pagan survivals are coming into this as well. So we see this is very, very politicized around the axis of male to female, in very strong patriarchal emphasis, which is really visible in the trials themselves because you have all male judges and predominantly female accused being forced to their knees, being tortured, being forced to parrot these sexualized demonologies and pornographies for the benefit of their torturers, and then being burned at the stake, and being forced also to assent to the charges that are being read out in public against them, in the hope that they will be strangled and not burned alive. And so this goes on all through the period of the mass hunts, which lasts longer than the dates you'll often see, 1650 or something like that. No, Eastern Europe, much later, into the end of the 1700s in Scotland and Switzerland, for example, Hungary, Poland, different places. But it's not only burning at the stake that went on. In England, in the 1500s, they began hanging witches instead. And so you'll see images of that. But fines, exile, bannings, imprisonment, branding So the woman who's branded, maybe that time she's not executed, but later she's at risk because people see, well, she's been branded. So, she would accuse more than once. Now, I want to look at a specific persecutory theme that comes up in this demonological pornography that is recited under torture in the dungeons of Europe. And that is the way that devil worship both encodes male dominance, which is raped painfully by the devil, with themes of white racism. And we have to look back first at this to see the idea of black devils, the devil as an Ethiopian, as an African, that are already found in the early medieval period, various Christian writings, and then later these images start to come up. By the end of the Middle Ages, we see images of black devils carrying off white women. This guy's got his nose in the book. But this theme is present in medieval Europe, and it is an element in the racist ideology later on under the slave states of the Americas. And so you'll see even in the matter of Britain, the Arthurian epics, you'll see themes of a spirit who comes, a demon who comes and impregnates a woman. And here he's being, the spirit is being shown as a black devil. There's a lot of bleed over of this that happens into authentic ethnic, in this case, Celtic tradition. Here's another one with the devil carrying off a priest's concubine. And so this, again, this abduction theme, this rape theme that's going on, and he's taking her into the infernal realms. But there's also a very strong sexist element because the priest has a concubine, but only she is punished. He's just kind of watching it all happen, and so that is there very strongly in this diabolist ideology. And we continue to see black devils torturing the damned, the theme of sexual intrusion, aggression. This is Santa Rosa de Lima, and so she's being sexually tempted by a black devil. This is to show her virtue. And you also see this theme coming through with anti-Semitic elements to it, so that the devil is Jewish. And this is something we can still see in 20th century art about devils, sometimes Jewish appearing devils. But you also have a lot of representation of devils as female. This is from the, maybe it's around 1600 from Germany, and then down here from Spain in the 11th century. The mystery plays of the Catholic Church show God the Father as a male doctor, professor, theologian, God the Son as a young aristocratic prince, and Satan as a female animalized being that's kind of a chimeric creature. So the female is symbolizing the demonic in quite a bit of this art, and so do intersex people. So you will find female breasts and male genitalia on quite a number of images of devils from this period. And what I take from this is that in the medieval mind, there is probably, this could also be a way of symbolizing gays as having the traits of both sexes, or even, what would now be called trans, a category that did not necessarily exist then in the terminology. But, any of these groups, anybody gender nonconforming would be seen within this lens as being devilish, as being evil. And so if there is this inherent evil and inferiority in women who are more prone to be taken over by devils, they become possessed, and they have to be exorcised. And this is not unique, as we see here, to Europe. We find exorcism of women being carried out in Chinese art. We even have these horrific exorcism chairs with these awful spikes that you're forced to be crushed down onto in order to exorcise demons. And these have a lot of resemblance to the witches' chairs that were used in tortures, particularly in Germany in the 1600s. And so the spikes are bad enough, but they would take a tray of incandescent coals, and all of this would be heated up, so she would be tortured with fire and iron. And you either died or you confessed with this torture. You weren't going to survive it either way. And so there's a lot of them. I keep finding new examples of them. And you can see that the clamps to hold their hands down are also equipped with spikes. Going backwards here. So this theme of exorcism, just coming back to that, you have a very strong element of the holy man, who is a man, always a man, driving out, as the priest, driving out devils, and here again, black devils, from women who are possessed by devils. And this is a ceremonial domination, a rite of mastery. He's got the rope around, this is his, actually one of his priestly garments. He's throwing it around her neck. He's dragging her around by it. He could be choking her with it. In some cases, the priest is described as standing on her body to show that he has dominated the demon. And this was a kind of a ritual of domination. And so, for example, here the woman falls to the ground. She can either be a witch and someone who damages others and someone who has power, or she can show, no, I'm powerless, I'm helpless, the devils are controlling me, and get some sympathy on some level from the exorcists and maybe escape being burned at the stake. But this was a very violent process, and the exorcisms by priests in the convent possessions, particularly in France and Belgium, show this. This very strong, you'll see images also of the men who are restraining her while the priest is doing whatever he's doing to her, with their hands groping her breasts. And this same sexualizing violence is also something enacted within Protestant Christianity in Africa. And you've got a lot of scenes like this. This is a Nigerian art showing him ripping off her clothing in order to throw the devils out from her. And so the child witches have to be exorcised, and it may not necessarily save them, but there are these accusations spreading. In India, also, exorcism is used to subjugate women inside marriage. And so if she's a rebellious wife, if she's a daughter-in-law who is not considered sufficiently self-effacing, they call in an exorcist, in this case a woman who's got her by the hair, and the brother-in-law is applying pincers to her fingers. They're inflicting torture on her in order to get her to go back into submission that is demanded of a married woman and daughter-in-law. And we see this same kind of pincer torture applied to the tongue of an African woman. This is very old, Greek, 24 centuries ago. Greek art from showing the satyrs torturing this African woman. So the idea of the evil of the sorceress, who can be tortured, who can be killed, in this case stabbed in the head by the young nobleman, and you see not only the femaleness and the age of this sorceress, but also her blackness as a symbol of evil. This black devil concept is found a lot in Southern Asia and Eastern Asia, and not only in Europe. And that's related to their own colonizations of older historic populations. So anyhow, this process of persecution of witches, of Jews, of heretics continues. The Spanish Inquisition especially turned their sights on Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity. And then they said, well, you're Judaizing, you didn't really give it up. And so these torture trials and burnings went on for centuries. They did target witches, and here you've got an old woman being forced to wear the heretic hat and badgered by monks. But they did a lot less witch burnings in Spain than they did in other parts of Europe, because the primary target there was Jews and also to some extent Muslims after the Spanish reconquest, the Christian reconquest of Spain. But as I was mentioning, these witch trials go on through into modern times. Now, here's an example, late time, again, female defendants, male judge, jury, and executioner. And even after the trials and the torture trials are put a halt to, and the burnings come to a halt, you still have the stigmatizing and the shunning and sometimes violent lynching attacks on old women, disabled women. This is in the Basque country of Spain. Picasso also picks up this idea of disability as something that somehow, in this case blindness, makes a woman identifiable as a witch. And you also have symbolic witch burnings that are continuing, really in a terrible irony, on the occasions of the old pagan holidays. The festivals turn into times in Austria, in Spain, in Germany, in different places where a witch is burned in effigy, not any longer in the flesh. And within all this whole time span, there is a lot of violence that is very much along the lines of the sexual double standard. So women who bear children out of wedlock would be flogged. I just now today found this because I was looking up burial alive, which I knew was a punishment for female inchastity in China or for adultery. And then I found a bunch of evidence for it also in Denmark and in Germany, in Czechia, and in Austria. And so we see, for example, between 1412 and 1447, that's only 35 years, 10 women buried alive on the basis of either infanticide or also you'll see women who are committing adultery being punished in this way. And there is also, and there are very, very few pictures of this, a long, long European history of punishing and humiliating women in the sex trade. And so this prostituted woman is forced to strip and then climb into this cage. They're going to lower her probably into the river or the canal. And so a form of ducking, which we're going to come back to. And prostitutes, as we know from the Roman writer Tacitus from the 1st century, so that's 2,000 years ago, in German countries, had their heads shaved and were paraded in humiliating ways through the villages. And here we're seeing this in the aftermath of when the French resistance finally comes back into power. The Allies take Europe back from the Nazis. You have women who were known to have had sex or accused of having sex with the Germans, having their head shaved, being paraded through towns, if they were lucky, because some of these women were actually executed. And a lot of this was, where it was actually true, was survival sex. All right, I want to talk more about silencing women, because this is still a very important piece of persecutory behavior that we're still seeing reflections of in modern culture. These legacies are still very much alive. So this is a head cage that's known as the branks, or the scold's bridle, or the witch's bridle. And so it's an iron piece that's fastened over her head. There's a flange that goes in against her tongue to hold her tongue down so she cannot speak. Sometimes there are spikes on it. So it's actually a torture implement, which could actually kill you if the infection goes to your upper palate and then to your brain. And this is worn by judicial decree. It's put on women who are disobedient wives, who are scolds, who do not defer to men, and they could be humiliated by driving them through the streets. This is something that we know happened in Germany, in Scotland, in England, and other countries in Europe. Some of these are actual torture devices in their own right, as you can see here with the vice that could be tightened over her skull to make it painful to wear. Also, the bridle is used in slavery, enforcement of the oppression of people in the African diaspora, particularly in Brazil and the Caribbean. And so there's the legendary slave Anastasia, who was a folk healer and who is, subjected to the gag and also to the iron collar, which was in very general use in the slave states. Humiliation and torture. And if you're wearing this, this is forged onto your body. How do you sleep? How do you lie down? You've always got this in your way. And again, the mask preventing speech. So resistant Africans of whichever sex are also being subjugated to this. But other forms beside the witch's bridle, you've got the cucking stool or the ducking stool, which is a piece of machinery devised for the sole purpose of dunking a woman in a river or a lake or a sewage canal as a way of punishing her, and very often for speech. And so cucking also comes from the same word as cuckold. So one of the uses of this stool was to punish a woman, here you can see her defiance, for violating the sexual double standard. You know, it could be for fornication, or it could be for adultery, or some other thing that men were not punished in the same way for. But female speech is really problematic in patriarchy, because for women to voice what is happening to them, to speak out and to name the oppression, is forbidden. And so the suffragists are shown here in this cartoon having their tongue cut out. Here we've got the activist from Colombia, Maria Cano, shown being forcibly gagged at the point of bayonets by the forces of the state. This was a woman who was an activist for labor rights. And we also see binding and gagging as themes in modern pornography. This would also include, by the way, dungeons, whipping, torture. All of these forms of symbolism are applied as a sexual turn-on. And you can see that the way that the sexualization of torture was enacted on European culture, was basically branded into people's mentality, has lasting effects. And so the gag, we can see a direct line between the witch's bridle worn here and the bridle, the gag that's used on women in pornography. This is from maybe the 50s or 60s. Also, you can see here some examples of the spike. This is the tongue flange that was, forced into her mouth. So there's a direct lineage there between these. And another way that we see the persistence of the witch hunting theme is in burn turfs, kill turfs, die turfs. This is a reference to, quote unquote, trans-exclusionary radical feminists who are supposedly so evil that anything can be done to them, and including use of the medieval executioner attacking a woman dressed as a modern lesbian. And so this has become a discourse of female silencing with very sexualized aspects to it. But the violence, threats, death threats, rape threats, die cis scum here, baseball bats, sometimes wrapped with barbed wire. And so kill turfs, dead turfs, punch turfs, slap turfs, use of classical sexist insults. All of this is being ignored as it is deployed within not just social media, but within academia, the left, the pagan movement, the queer movement, and within feminism itself. Rhetoric of extermination. They gotta die. I want to kill them. So those are all, the epithet is being used as a way of silencing women. Now, finally, I want to look at religious persecution and conquest, and I want to back up again to the time of the early Spanish colonization of the Indies, the West Indies of the Americas. And this is a papal bull called Inter Cetera, which gives to the kings of Spain the rights over all islands and mainlands found. And basically they're starting to realize, there's all these countries, and guess what? We're going to take them over and give authority over them to the new Spanish colonials, who begin exporting the same methods of religious persecution, of ethnic persecution that we saw going on already in Europe. And so, for example, Bartolomé de las Casas describes how the Taino chief Hatue was burned at the stake in Haiti in 1512. And he describes how a priest comes up and tries to get him to accept Jesus as his savior so he could go to heaven. And Hatue asks the priest, well, do you Spaniards, are you going to be in heaven? And well, of course. And so the Taino said, without thinking any further, he did not want to go there, but to hell, because he did not want to be where such cruel people as him would be there. And so you see these representations of burning from the very early colonial period, and there are connections to be made here that are very direct. So that, for example, Juan de Zumárraga, a Basque witch hunter in the 1520s in Spain, becomes Bishop of Mexico, in that capacity burns Aztecs at the stake. And of course, we have also the book burnings that went on in Europe are now being applied to the incomparable treasures of the Aztecs, the Maya, and other Central American peoples, entire libraries, knowledge that will never be recovered, being burned. And so the export of all of the stereotypes of the witch, the same forms, the European witch with her familiars, this is saying punishment by the Holy Inquisition, is exported to Peru, to Colombia, to Mexico, and to the Caribbean. So Jean Baudin, who was a famous, great humanist that was praised very up into the very late 20th century as a wonderful scholar, but he was a judge of witches, a very ruthless one, killed many women and even girls. But he also projected the Diabolist ideology on the Americas and saying the gods of these countries are none other than the devil. And so you have Europeans viewing the indigenous religion. This is not an authentic depiction. This is a European fantasy about what Taino religion would look like. And so they were using the ideology of their conversion to the one true religion to justify conquest, land seizure, and slavery. And so there again, whoever baptizes, to him the ruler stick. This was very much enacted by the popes through the centuries that followed the initial European realization that there were these other continents. And so they demonized all dark peoples, all non-Christians, and that included the Romani, indigenous peoples, Africans, people of the Pacific. This has, again, nothing to do with actual ceremony in Virginia. This is completely a European projection, which may have even been done by a woodcutter that had never set foot in Virginia. So I want to look a little bit at how diabolism plays itself out in these colonial ideologies. And so we have our starting point imagery of black devils. We looked at this white angels, black devils, we saw a little bit earlier on. And this continues to be a theme in religious theater in Spain and then being carried over into the Americas. These are not Ku Klux Klan members. These are members of Spanish brotherhoods, penitential brotherhoods, who often accompanied victims of the Inquisition as they were being led to the auto da fe. So you can see connections going on here. Here's another, the Klansman as a crusader. This is an important part of the symbolism around the late 1800s and beginning of the 1900s. And it's still being taken up by the Trumpian white supremacists. We also see the burning at the stake being applied against African diaspora people, such as Kwaku, who was executed in New York City in 1741, burned at the stake for rebelling against slavery. And burning was very often part of the lynchings that proceeded from the time of the Reconstruction all the way through into the 1960s in the United States. And burning, torture, dismemberment, some of the same horrific practices that we saw going on in the religious persecutions in Europe are being applied along a racialized axis in the caste system in the United States. Most people think about lynchings, they think about the South. They happened in Indiana. They happened in a lot of northern states, in the West certainly. But another method of keeping Black people down was the sundown town. Don't let the sun catch you in this, don't be caught in this town after sunset, because here's what we'll do to you. It's a threat of violence. And it was enforced with violence. And meanwhile, this symbolism of black devils continues right along and is still part of Disney cartoons and posada woodcuts in Mexico, many, many different contexts. The religious aspect of conquest is when they saw the Siberians in this picture, people in the Americas, Africans, the Pacific Islands, the Philippines, and so forth. They saw these, they defined these as inferior, savage, barbaric people who were superstitious. And so a lot of key words, trigger words, are employed in unbeliever, kafir being an Arabic form in the Muslim world, or zindiq, which means heretic, but especially devil worshiper, the demonization of voodoo. I'm going to look at fetish in a second. We've seen cannibal. And this is from National Geographic in the 50s. This balanced view of the red man, prehistoric, savage. So, these interpretations are part of the basis of the persecution that's carried out. And in Africa, it was religious persecution. They were age-old customs and beliefs and heritages that are being recast as sorcery, as devil worship. Fetição means witchcraft in Portuguese. And that's where the word fetish comes from, which has been used, and supposedly in scientific terms, this word was still being used in anthropology until very recently, to refer to sacred objects such as the nkisi of Congo peoples. Here's a French engraving that describes African trance priestesses as féticheuses with their shakery rattles. And so everything is seen through a negative European sour view of these traditions. And ultimately, fetish turns around and becomes a word for sexual kinks. And so here you've got like a super high-heeled shoe, which is part of fetish wear in modern culture, but you've got the African icon being literally stepped on in this shoe. Another aspect of the conquest is the enforcement. In order to enforce European supremacy and the Christian religion as part of that, you have a regimentation, which we can see here from Paraguay in the 1700s, forcing the Guarani people to live in barracks, to try and, in many cases, force them to stop using their native languages. And so in both Canada and the United States, we have the Indian boarding schools. And you have entire generations of children, and notice the uniforms, it's again regimented, being punished for speaking their own language, being forced to wear quote unquote Western dress. And the Carlisle School, one of the most notorious of these prison schools, where children were stolen from their parents in the Great Plains and sent east to Pennsylvania, they want the Indian in you to be dead. And so that was the goal, that was the stated goal. But the same thing went on in Australia. And so you've got this is where the term the stolen generations first arose. And children, especially children of mixed race, but not necessarily only that, would be sent, and again, lining up, forced to stand, forced to repeat prayers, caned for speaking their native languages. And in all of these places, you have destruction of sacred objects by burning, sometimes carried off into museums or private collections. And everything we see in this picture is in the process now of being repatriated, because there's been a movement to restore things that were stolen, like these beautiful ceremonial baskets of the Yokuts people in California, and to recover them. The problem is that the museum curators very often impregnated these objects with arsenic or mercury or other highly poisonous substances, so that the masks, though returned, can never be worn again because they've been poisoned. But you see all these forms of social exclusion. And this is part of persecutory culture. I mean, it's certainly part of the racialized caste system, but various groups, in some cases Jews and Irish, other cases more commonly natives, black people, and Mexicans being targeted, being excluded, being kept out. And what a lot of people don't know is that there were actually massacres of black people in the United States long after the Civil War was over. And so, these will be referred to sometimes as race riots, but really you're talking about white mobs pouring into black sections of town and massacring them and forcing them out, burning Black Tulsa, for example, to the ground, what they once called Black Wall Street. And so in Coushatta, Louisiana, the White League stages a massacre of black people. There's a monument there to the men of the White League who did this atrocity. And, so this is not something that's just gone. The monuments to it still exist. Same thing happened to the Chinese in many parts of the West, in Idaho, Washington. Well, here you see Denver, certainly in California. Killings, lynchings, confiscations of property, and especially expelling them, forcing them out. Here in Crescent City, California, this is an expulsion of the Chinese, but the Crescent City is also notorious for one of the worst massacres of Native peoples on the west coast of what's now the United States at Crescent City. Meanwhile, through all this time, pogroms are going on in the Ukraine, in various parts of Eastern Europe, and they actually had spread to Syria and other places in the Muslim world. You see Muslims going after Hindus in Bangladesh during the terrible civil war that tore the country apart along along religious lines. And you have Hindu nationalists doing the same thing to Muslims just as recently as 6 years ago in Gujarat. The Copts being a target as Christians in Egypt. Muslims being the target in Buddhist Burma and being expelled once again. Some killed, others forced out into refugee camps. The Yazidi, who are neither Christian nor Muslim nor any of the other categories that most people know about, Kurdish people in Iraq and Syria being targeted by the Daesh extremists. And witch hunting is something that still exists in this world. India and Nepal are some places, particularly in the Aboriginal regions of those countries. Women are being executed, are being burned, and you have also these persecutions going on in various regions of Africa. These are from West Africa, and we're looking here at the witches of Gambaga. It's actually a witch village of women who have been refugees from their home communities. Many cases, widows, old women being singled out that way. But you can see also children being targeted in witch persecutions. Here's the burnings of 5 women in Tanzania just last year. I should be giving you trigger warnings through this whole show, but just watch out these next ones. This is Papua New Guinea, and it's always women and it's always men who are attacking the women, and the women just kind of go away. They try to, oh, please don't look in my direction. Don't dare interfere, and also horrific burnings on pyres of those tortured women. But in the West, who was supposedly gotten over all of this, you still see a cultural celebration of the witch hunter as hero in movies like this. We have not digested this persecutory attitude toward women in Western Civ, so that men who are angry at their girlfriends or ex-wives can shoot at them with target practice with these dummies that are made specifically for them to vent their rage on. Throwing acid in the faces of women because they refuse to marry or have sex with men. And this is all over Southern Asia. So, I know that's a lot. You can see all kinds of pretexts, all kinds of categories of human beings who have been targeted by torture, by murder, by expulsion, shunning, banning, imprisonment. And we aren't free of this in this world even now. Under Trump, we're seeing a resurrection of this open hatred and this open calling for violence against the hated group, whether it's lesbian feminists being called TERFs and killed TERFs and all TERFs should die, to the very strong racialized persecution of immigrants who are coming in across the borders of the United States, or those who have been here for centuries and centuries and are being shot down in cold blood or beaten by the police. These are oppressions, but the ideology, the persecutory ideology that some people are better than others, some people are evil and must be stopped and we need violence to do that, that is still very much with us, and that is what we have to end. So I am going to just invite you, if you're not already subscribers to the online course on women's history that I am currently doing. This slideshow is part of that. Every month we have at least one visual webcast like this. And of course, you can always subscribe, as some of you have done, over the net, and just do individual subscriptions for topics you're interested in. There's a Patreon now that I've opened up, and it's patreon.com/maxdashu, MAXDASHU. I'm going to open up now for discussion, questions, and comments. And so I'm going to unmute you all and see how to do that. I know that's very overwhelming to watch. I just want to see this end. And I don't know any other way to do it than to talk about it and to talk about the historical patterns, because it's like with the Jew roasters in Germany in the 1300s. And then you've got Auschwitz in the mid-20th century. These evils don't go away on their own, especially not if they're based on scriptures. You know, but patriarchy too is something very old, and you see the renewal of these ways of punishing women that just keep coming back. So I'm going to have a drink, and you can question. Don't be shy. Maybe it was just too much. There are things that no pictures exist of. And that's part of the issue in trying to do history in this visual mode, that the persecution of women in the sex trade, for example, is something very, very common. Using violence, using forms of humiliation, using gang rape. You see gang rape also being used in some indigenous societies to punish women who dared to peek at the male ceremonies. And a lot of times these traditions say that the ceremonies were originally in the hands of women, but were taken over by men. And so the punishment, whether you're in the Amazon basin or elsewhere, becomes raping, mass raping, in order to teach her a lesson.
Hi, Max, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around, you know, Trump's constant reference to the trials or to the Mueller investigation and so on as a witch hunt, and why he keeps going on with that phrase. Do you see any significance in that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, this is a pattern where you have white men who are normally not the ones being subjected to witch hunts using that phrase. So, for example, when you had accusations of sexual abuse against males, you will find them using the word witch hunt because they're actually for once being held accountable. And that's what I see happening with Trump, is that he's falling back on this. I mean, the more modern use of the word witch hunt we can trace to the McCarthy era. And I don't know if everybody knows here about McCarthyism, but in the intensely anti-communist Cold War atmosphere of the late 40s and early 50s, there was a guy named McCarthy, a senator, who held hearings on quote unquote un-American activities. And people who were suspected of being pinkos would be hauled in front of Congress to testify and forced to denounce people that they knew as possibly being communist sympathizers. And so it was in this context that the word witch hunt was revived. And that's why Arthur Miller, who was one of that persecuted group, wrote his play on The Crucible, talking about the Salem witch hunts as a metaphor for what was going on in modern America. And so the phrase has also been used to refer to what were actually witch hunts by the US military, particularly against lesbians. Gay men too, but especially lesbians were vulnerable to this. And so Judy Grahn has written about this. She was in the armed services during the period this was, it's been going on for a long time, but they would target lesbians and they would force them to name other lesbians, or that they would be punished themselves. And in some cases, the punishment included extorting sex from women who were being accused. And so you had male officers extorting sex from those women, saying, well, I'm going to turn you in as a lesbian. You have to have sex with me or else. So that's the background for the modern US usage of the term. But you've seen a lot of pattern of right-wingers, basically, or either male chauvinists or right-wingers, I guess it's probably pretty much of the same, deploying this terminology. And I think for Trump, his methodology has been very clearly, if he's accused of having something, of doing something, he will accuse others of doing what he's doing, and vice versa. So the witch hunt terminology came very easily to his lips, but actually, that's something that his administration is engaging in itself. So it's like by turning it around 180 degrees, the best defense is a good offense, and that's what they're doing.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for that. Because it always bothers me whenever I hear him say it. I just make a change. Yeah.
That's for sure. Other comments? I don't want to force you to talk. I just thought I would give you a little space to see if anybody had anything else to ask or say. If not, then I'm going to close off. First, I've got to remember to end the recording. So we will have this